So, coming as no real surprise given all the background noise over the past few days, Israeli fighter jets bombed Iran. Not a cyber attack, not a covert sabotage mission, a real physical airstrike on nuclear sites no less, as well as civilian infrastructure. And if you're thinking, wait, was Iran about to launch a nuke? Well, if you believe that, then I have a piece of prime real estate in the South Pole I think you'd be interested in. Of course Iran wasn't about to launch a nuke. Regardless of what you might have heard on the Western news media and from politicians or from an assortment of other Israel apologists in the global north. The truth is this wasn't about stopping an imminent nuclear threat. This was about politics, it was about power, and that's it. Well, not quite. It's also about a prime minister fighting for his survival. So, in the early hours of the 13th of June, Israeli jets hit Tehran. They attacked multiple Iranian nuclear facilities, but also a lot of civilian infrastructure, with civilian children, at least 20 at the last count, having been killed. They say their main target was Natanz, one of Iran's most sensitive uranium enrichment sites. Iran says the damage was minimal, although they do admit that several key scientists were killed in the attack, as was the commander of the influential Revolutionary Guard. Israeli sources claim the strikes were highly successful. Either way, this wasn't just messaging. This was a high-risk, high-stakes attack. So why now? Well, to understand this, you have to zoom out. Because this isn't just about Israel versus Iran. This is a high-stakes geopolitical game in which every country of any influence around the world has a vested interest. For example, Iran is becoming central to a much larger geopolitical puzzle. China has signed a $400 billion 25-year agreement with Iran, building infrastructure, locking in energy access, and deepening strategic ties. Russia is using Iranian drones in Ukraine. Iran is becoming Moscow's quiet weapons supplier. And the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, well, they're normalizing ties with both Israel and Iran at the same time. Interestingly, China is actually the one brokering peace now and not the United States. Which brings us to Washington. The US is trying to walk a very narrow line, publicly committed to Israel's security, privately, however, trying to avoid a wider regional war. Israel sees all this and realizes that if they wait any longer, Iran may become too protected diplomatically, economically, militarily, to strike. But the real story isn't actually even about Iran. It's actually about Benjamin Netanyahu. At home, he's currently looking a corruption trial in the face, including charges of bribery and breach of trust. His ruling coalition has always been fragile, it still is. It depends on far-right, ultra-religious parties bordering on the fanatical, who are constantly threatening to walk away if he even suggests a pause or a softening in posture in the ongoing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. And on top of that, Israel has seen historic protests, hundreds of thousands of citizens marching through the streets of Tel Aviv. Why? Well, Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to overhaul the judiciary, to gut it, essentially giving himself immunity while in power. So, what does a leader do when he's on the verge of political collapse? Of course, he shifts the narrative. He creates a crisis, unites his base. A strike on Iran does all of that. It distracts from the courtroom problems, it puts rivals on the back foot, and it forces the public to rally behind their wartime prime minister. Of course, this isn't the first time a leader has used foreign aggression to dodge domestic accountability, and it won't be the last. This time, the risks are enormous because Iran has options. They have allies across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, while weakened by surgical strikes against them by Israel, still has assets ready to exact revenge. They're also very capable, very active, and crucially, very motivated militias in both Iraq and in Syria. Alongside them, of course, are cyber warfare units on standby. A response? Any response could hit Israeli cities. It could target US bases. It could shut down oil routes. And this time, Iran is not isolated. Russia is watching. China is invested. The Gulf is cautiously trying to stay neutral. One wrong move, and this could turn into a region-wide conflict, maybe even something much bigger. And of course, last night, that's exactly what happened. Iran retaliated directly. Precision-guided missile and drone strike that hit targets in central Tel Aviv. Not random buildings, strategic defense installations, air defense grids, surveillance nodes, even a suspected cyber warfare operations center. And they didn't use 1990s-era HARP. This was state-of-the-art Iranian military tech, domestically upgraded Shahid drones, radar-evading missiles, jamming systems, the kind of capability Israel was banking on not seeing this soon. No deniability, no ambiguity. This was Iran saying loud and clear, we see you, and we're not playing defense anymore. But here's the part that was always going to happen. Western leaders are already framing this as Iranian aggression. The same governments that said little to nothing when Israeli bombs fell on Natanz are now flooding the airways with calls for restraint from Iran. Mainstream headlines are calling it an escalation. US and European officials are invoking the language of red lines, but not for Israel's initial airstrike, for Iran's response. So once again, retaliation is being rebranded as provocation, and that's the problem. Because the West's selective outrage is the very thing will now justify further Israeli action, harden Iranian resolve, and set the entire region on a spiral neither side can ever fully control. We've now crossed into uncharted territory. This is no longer just about message sending. This is open confrontation. And with each strike and with each counterstrike, the window for diplomacy is shrinking. It's shrinking fast. All of this is happening at a time when global perceptions of Israel are starting to shift. For decades, Israel has enjoyed near total support from the US and from the West, even in the face of widespread criticism over its actions in Gaza. But now something's changing. International media outlets, even major ones, are no longer giving Israeli spokespeople a free pass. They're being challenged. They're being asked the hard questions. Journalists in the US and in Europe pushing back against the old narratives. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has reached a point that it's just impossible to ignore. The pressure's building on Netanyahu, not just to end the airstrikes, but to allow full-scale humanitarian aid back into Gaza. Fuel, water, medicine, even food. It's not just the press, it's a legal issue. The International Court of Justice has already indicted Netanyahu and his hardline defense minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes. These are serious formal charges, and they're hanging over every decision he makes. Even AIPAC, the powerful pro-Israeli lobby in the US, is going to feel the pressure. It's becoming harder for them to justify to their base unconditional support for Israel when images of bombed hospitals and starving children are dominating global headlines. Meanwhile, in the US, Trump is back, and this time he's calling himself a peacemaker. This isn't random, he's actually hoping for a Nobel Peace Prize. He said as much, but there's a catch. Trump's base. They don't want American troops involved in another Middle Eastern war. They're tired of endless wars. They're focused on domestic issues. So now Trump is stuck. On one hand, he's historically pro-Israel. His administration, remember, moved the US embassy to Jerusalem. He's proud of the Abraham Accords. But on the other hand, he cannot afford to drag the US into yet another foreign war, especially not one that risks American lives or drains American resources. So what does he do? Support Israel too openly, and he risks alienating his voters. Stay neutral, and he risks being seen as weak on foreign policy. This puts Netanyahu in a very vulnerable position. He's used to having full American backing. Now, that support is starting to feel conditional. So what does happen next? Well, here are 5 possible scenarios. Scenario 1 is de-escalation. International pressure forces Israel to pause further military action. A fragile ceasefire is negotiated. Iran refrains from any further major retaliation, and aid starts flowing into Gaza under tight international supervision. Scenario 2 is that the US recalibrates its support. Trump listens to his base and publicly pressures Israel to show restraint. Military aid continues, but with new conditions. This, of course, weakens Netanyahu politically and emboldens opposition voices in Israel. The third scenario is the one that happened yesterday, is with Iran retaliating directly by launching missiles into Israel, by proxy militias being activated, and what's the danger right now is the region is descending into tit-for-tat violence that pulls in US allies and forces new lines to be drawn. The fourth scenario is a regional proxy war. Instead of full-on confrontation, Iran escalates through proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, as well as others. Israel responds with wider operations in Lebanon and Syria. The war becomes long, decentralized, and devastating. The fifth scenario of global political realignment, which is where Israel, facing legal scrutiny, humanitarian backlash, and declining support from its younger Western audiences, its alliances with the West begins to fray. China steps in as a mediator, pushing itself deeper into Middle Eastern power politics, while the US influence slowly erodes. This moment is dangerous, but it's also quite revealing. It shows us how quickly global alliances can shift, how narratives can change, and how leaders, when cornered, will do just about anything to survive. And here's the irony no one wants to say out loud. What Netanyahu just did may have pushed Iran closer to developing a nuclear weapon, not further away. Because if you're sitting in Tehran right now, you're not looking at diplomacy. You're looking at what happened to Libya, a country that gave up its nuclear program, trusted the West, and got invaded. And then, on the other hand, you're looking at North Korea, isolated, sanctioned, and still standing because it has nukes. The lesson for Iran is brutally clear. If you don't have a nuclear deterrent, you're vulnerable to airstrikes, to regime change, and to international humiliation. Netanyahu may have just done the one thing every Western analyst has warned against. He's given Iran a strategic incentive to go full tilt toward a nuclear arsenal, not for attack, simply for survival. And that changes everything. So, thanks for watching, and if this helped you make sense of what's happening, give it a like, leave a comment, subscribe, and let's keep this conversation going. Because this isn't just news, it's a warning. Thank you, and good luck.